Welcome back, and I'm so excited for you. We're going to start with one of the most beautiful conversations of the summit. Inside of this conversation, you're going to find reflective gold. It's a conversation between Nick and Mike, who I found through their podcast, Napcast, which I'll have a link below, where you can hear more of their dynamic conversations. Okay, so let me read a little bit about both of them. Nick Terrones was born and raised in Los Angeles, California, in the territory of his ancestors, the Duwamish people. He is also of Latino descent. After 14 years playing in the classroom, Nick took on a new challenge as a director of a preschool program called Daybreak Star Preschool. Mike Browne is an East Coast transplant from New York with an MBA degree in international business and marketing. He currently serves as the Senior Community Engagement Manager at Hilltop Children's Center and Educators Institute, where he organizes culturally responsive PD workshops and opportunities for teachers and leaders working with young children. Without further ado, let's go to this pure gold conversation. Welcome back. I am so excited to have Mike and Nick here. Welcome.
This is an absolute honor to be here. You know, I almost didn't respond to the email actually because it was late at night when I got it, and it was a LinkedIn message. And you know, most of it when I get LinkedIn messages, it's just people trying to sell me stuff. And boy, I'm really glad I did. I took that risk and opened it up, and because look at where we are right now. You know, started from the bottom, now we're on fairy dust. So yeah, I once again, Mike Browne, pronouns are he, him, Afro-Caribbean, educator of color, originally from Buffalo, New York. And you get all the background details later, but you know, I currently work at Hilltop Children's Center and Educator Institute in Seattle, Washington, on the traditional lands of the Duwamish tribe. And we're a Reggio-inspired preschool, after-school program, and equity-focused professional development institute, really supporting early childhood professionals who are working directly and indirectly with children and families. And my role there is everything. You know, so that's what happens when you're in the nonprofit sector. You know, at 8 a.m., I'm welcoming children to our center. At 10 a.m., well, we just opened up this new classroom. So I was supporting our new half day program. 12 p.m., I'm leading an anti-racism workshop around ECE. And then at 2 p.m., it's pickup time. So I'm really happy to be here. And I'm joined, of course, to the Tom to my Jerry, the Pikachu to my Ash, Nick.
Hi. Well, last time I thought I was your Toad to your Princess from Mario Brothers, but and again, I'm Nick Terrones, he, him, or my pronouns. As Mike mentioned, I'm identify culturally as Mexican and Native American, and you know, and many more identifiers as well. And you know, I recently moved out of the classroom after 14 years, 12 of those years working with toddlers and their families. And I was at Hilltop Children's Center. And now I'm in the role of director at Daybreak Star Preschool, also in Seattle, Washington, just kind of down the road from Hilltop. And you know, right now I'm overlooking the Salish Sea, also known as the colonized name of Puget Sound. And it's, you know, a beautiful sunny day. And on March 8th, on Monday, it's going to be the day that this land that I'm on right now was taken over by a group they call the Gang of Four. And it was made up by a Native American man by the name of Bernie White Bear, and then a couple of other gentlemen from the African American community, the Latino community, and the Asian Pacific Islander community. And they all banded together to do a peaceful takeover of this of Fort Lawton, and they were successful in being able to take over spots around Seattle and develop cultural centers. And that's where Daybreak is situated and where I'm blessed to be able to be at right now. And, you know, I'm super excited to talk about about play. And I think, Mike, we don't often get to like dive deep into play. Well, I mean, maybe we have a little bit on Napcast, but maybe not as deep as I think we're going to go now. And, play is definitely something near and dear to my heart. And through my time as a teacher researcher, I've come up with, and across many ideas of around play.
And I was trying to think last night and a couple of days ago, like, what the heck are we going to call this? Right? Because I always like to make themes and call it and make it pretty. The summer's on play, and play in early childhood is really such a vital part of our growth as human beings. And yet, building an entire business and selling the idea to people that for majority of the day, we're just going to play seems like a business, a risky thing to do. And that's where it kind of came to me overnight. Well, actually, it came to me, I was sipping on some whiskey, but that's something different. And
teacher inspiration.
Yeah, exactly. And it came to me, risky play is risky business. Risky play is risky business.
Yeah, it is indeed. And I like how you frame it in the concept of play through the lens of business, because childcare and education, as I'm learning as a director, is essentially a business. And we're in the business of play, right? And we juggle, what we know is good for and rich for children in play, and then also having to meet, quote unquote, learning outcomes. Importantly, though, what I'm excited to talk about with you is, how does the concept of play, this business, look through the lens of equity? And what are the risks and rewards we're taking when embracing a pedagogy of play and equity?
Damn, you took the words out of my mouth. Why play is risky? Why is it a risky business? Who is it risky for? These are all some of the questions that I'm thinking of. But me, when we do these conversations and these programs and workshops, and especially in our podcast, I like to throw you out an easy kind of question first, just to warm you up. You ready?
Yes. Yeah, I'm ready.
Perfect. So play. Was it even a thing for you growing up in LA?
Yeah, it was. When I was thinking about, when I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking about all my family that was like in community that was around, mostly just family. I remember as little as a preschooler playing with Barbies and Ken dolls at a in-home childcare center. And my dad didn't care for that, I'll tell you that, and my mom would take me to these in-home childcare centers, and there were other children that we played with, because, both mom and dad worked long days and sometimes into the evening. And so we were with some other family, either my mom's friend or somebody. I don't know how they found each other back then, right? Like, there's not like, now it's easier to find childcare. My more solidified memories, though, were when I was in elementary school, and most of my play was solo and like insular when I wasn't with my cousins, and it was before my brother got bigger. And my parents didn't want me to wander outside of the yard very much, as the neighborhood was in stress. And I didn't even get to like ride my bike up and down the sidewalk outside of our home. And the one time I did, I got chased by, someone who had long been enduring the stress of the neighborhood. And I just remember that vividly, just like, I was just pedaling away and like, I got to get home, and getting up to the gate, and my dog's just like barking because I could sense the fear I was radiating. But I also played, baseball and football as a child. And when I wasn't in those organized sports, it again was playing football in the streets with my cousins at my grandma's house. But school was different kind of play. And I remember playing a lot of fighting games. And, when I look back at these games we played in elementary school with the lens that I have now, and I see that we're processing that strife that was going on around us. This was LA in the 90s. And even though my neighborhood wasn't in as much stress as like Compton or Watts or East LA at the time, we were still susceptible to that racial tension going on. In the book, I talk about this particular freeze tag game where it was called Blacks versus Cops. And if you were a kid who was black, whether or not you were actually black, um, you had to get from run from one side to the other while avoiding the taggers or the cops. And if they tagged you, then you had to get down on both knees, hands behind your head, and until another black came and saved you. And that was, I don't know, that game just kind of sticks out as like play.
Mm.
What about you, Mike?
Honestly, I can't remember playing at all as a child. Most specifically when I was in preschool or when I was a toddler. Like my earliest memory of play was just those small couple of days after school. You know, after school like went on summer break. So those 4 or 5 days, and right before my mom like shipped me off to my aunts in Florida, or or helping run my mom's family in-home childcare center. So my play was usually just riding my bike up and down the street because, like your neighborhood, my neighborhood was rough, and my old man, my pops, told us not to leave the block, and
Mm.
that was it. That's all the play I remember I was getting, and it definitely wasn't because my parents didn't believe I should be playing, but when you're in and out of poverty, when in when food insecurity is kind of all you ever know, when you're at risk of being back in transitional housing, when both of your parents are your caregivers, if you're lucky to even have one or both of them, right? They both
Mm-hmm.
have to work 2 jobs apiece. Play in my family and my community was such an afterthought. In my homie Ejima Jordan, who I think she presented last year on this, and it's constantly a resource I find myself coming back to. She says a lot that play is an equity issue, and I think this is partly what she means, because play is just not something many Black, Brown, Indigenous, and other children of color can afford the opportunity to do, both because of kind of the larger macro system and how the system views and treats our BIPOC babies. And there's also, more reasons why play is an equity issue. And I suggest everyone reaching out to her, bring her into your community, reach out, hire her, and really learn more um, about it.
Yeah, it's interesting, Mike. When you were saying that, I was thinking about some of my friends who grew up. They're from Mexican families, and most of them are first generation. I met them in college, and when I asked them, I remember having a conversation like, "Oh, what did you play when you grew up?" And they would laugh at me like, "We didn't really play. We were busy picking the fields.
Mm.
When we did play, it was throwing the rotten fruit at each other, or the rotten vegetables, or dirt clods." But that was like 5-10 minutes at best, and that was their play. And then by the time their picking time is done, they're tired, and they're kids, that are like helping their families like pick asparagus.
And I think that's why I dropped risky in our title, and probably risky already like 6 times already in this combo, because I really just want to hammer home that play is risky in so many different ways. In one way that I see it being risky isn't just when our kids are jumping and sliding and climbing or hanging upside down, because it's also, in my opinion, in rough and tumble or in our big body play. And Nick, I know you are a staunch advocate for rough and tumble play, and you got blogs, articles, of course, our Mapcast and videos out there on it. But my question is not about why rough and tumble or this sort of risky play is important for children development, but more of why is this type of play risky for children of color? And why must we
Mm-hmm.
be both advocates and set parameters when children of color are roughing around? And I know it sounds like a double standards, and well, that's because it is, because
Mm-hmm.
white children just aren't the ones being viewed and labeled as dangerous. They aren't the ones being disproportionately expelled from preschool and kindergarten. Children of color are. And as two male educators of color, I think we really need to always view, examine, and discuss everything through a racialized lens because our system wasn't intended for us, wasn't built for us. Our system continues to criminalize boys and young males of color. They still view us as predators, and they still view our even our young femme identifying children of color as less innocent.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, that's an interesting, um, yeah, I appreciate that. And, I'm thinking about, the current sort of atrocities that have been going on. And I wonder how that narrative is going to be changing in society in terms of white children and white boys, and especially when we're thinking of the concept of white rage. Um, how is rough and tumble play going to affect, or the lack thereof going to affect them and, and our children of color? And, but to humbly disagree, I don't think creating parameters around children of color roughhousing will help though, because I think that's that part of like cutting off the head to cure the headache. And, I think shifting the narrative through education and representation of teachers, more professional development in rough and tumble play, and recruitment and retainment of men of color, as well as gender nonconforming individuals, you know, and again, there's not going to be any like one quick fix. Otherwise, we'd be, as we say, we'd be millionaires if we had those answers. But I do, I totally agree that, historically Black and brown males have been seen through a lens that pigeonholes us in particular ways. And to your rough and tumble point, I think in general, most teachers simply don't have the understanding of the nuances in rough and tumble play, like how to really dissect when it's sort of happy aggressive and maybe not productive aggressive, and you pair that with a lack of understanding of Black and brown children and cultures, it's all just exacerbated more. And then it gets to that, like, it's just easier to cut off the head and cure the headache. Like, and these double standards get brought up, and really how are we defining play, I guess, not just in this conversation, but, for this summit as well, what lens are we seeing the concept of play through? And I know we're going to dive into the equity piece in a bit, but I wanted to zoom out a little bit and tell me what you think, Mike, of physically risky play and also known as big body play. What do you think we as adults are why are we so fearful of this type of play?
Well, I think somewhere along the lines, like this concept of risky play, which which I consider like jumping off a rock or swinging really fast on a rope swing. Somewhere along the lines, it just got misconstrued as hazardous play. And first of all, I get the idea that safe is such a relative term to people. What is safe for me may not be safe for you. What may be risky to you may not be risky to me. But I think there's one thing we can agree on, I'm hoping, right? I'm getting paid to protect your child. I guarantee that I am not trying to do any activity which puts me out of a job. So everything I do is child-centered. In other words, I'm taking into account the child's needs, abilities, skills, disposition, opportunities for growth, and then I'm working to try to scaffold and introduce things that outside of their comfort zone, things that may seem scary to them, seem risky to them. So risky play is really centered on them, not on us as educators.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my first thought on why adults are so fearful of this type of play, because we just have these misconceptions, or we are tailoring our ideas of risky play to the actual individual child. And I think the last thing that really makes us fearful of this type of play is that it's part of our want and need to feel like we're in control, right? That grounds us, that feeling that we're in control. And I think we've been socialized to think that control looks like a certain way. And we've been taught that control means everyone conforms to our opinions. Look at how the media or how books portray control. It's usually in the terms of respect, of obedience, of conformity. And that's a very white normative way of thinking. So, we love doing reflection questions. So I'm going to invite audience to pause and to think, what does it look like to give up control for yourself? What if we went from control like over children to co-construction and co-control with them?
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of that song sheet that I showed you that spelled out obedience that I just took from that young black girl at my school. I was like, no, you're not going to have this. So it's this song that's like, it's almost, I think maybe to the tune of Bingo, but it's spelled like obedience, which I'm not going to try to spell right now, but it's a song that talks about how you need to be obedient and how everything will be good for you if you're obedient. Her teacher gave her this. And what struck me though is that in one of the phrases of the verse, there's a picture of it's children of color that are like sitting at a table. And so what does that tell children of color, about like, hey, this song is actually for you, to be obedient, to be successful. But back to your point of control, I think before giving up control, educators, anyone really, they need to start with a little bit of self-reflection.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, reflection is such a big part of what we do. And building those reflective muscles to be able to see children play out some of their deepest thoughts and beliefs, and then introduce new materials or scaffold in some conversation. It takes time. It takes work. So I'm gonna throw it right back to you, Nick. Right? You're an amazing storyteller. So can you tell us a story of children play, and then what did you do in response to them after reflecting?
Yeah. Well, like that. One thing I like to carry is, self-reflection is and should be educators' like strongest tool. A deep capacity of self-reflection implores us to question everything we're choosing to do, to say, and sometimes feel. And we do allow ourselves to feel particular ways because of past experiences, right? And so we gotta, in conjunction of self-reflecting, we gotta build up emotional literacy to kind of understand what's going on within ourselves. Safety, for example, is one of those things that we bring as experiences to the table. And I found that the less that I do, the more I promote within the child. I get them to do the work and me to kind of step back. And this is again that sort of emptiness concept that we talked about earlier, also known as Wu Wei, which is a Taoist principle I picked up from practicing Bagua Kung Fu. But anyway, to the story, in my old toddler room, we had this like tiered shelf, and I think it's still there. And, it just screams, climb me to kids, to children. It looks like, and it's a very sturdy shelf, so it can hold them. I mean, I can climb it and stand on it and it's fine. But I realized like after a lot of times of just saying no and having that nagging feeling that makes you feel like the worst teacher. I think we all know that feeling when you're like, you go home at the end of the day and you're like, oh, how am I going to do this better? How am I going to do this that supports a strong image of the child? Me and my co-teachers put our heads together to find a way to say yes. And since I love physical play and have had experiences coaching children in martial arts and a couple of other sports, I began to think like, okay, how do I break this down? How do I break this process down in an age appropriate way, so that 2-year-olds can feel safe climbing on them? And what do the children need to know first? What do I need to know first? And what should I consider? And so I guess what like guided my new approach in that was, one, children are capable and want to know how, especially if it's something of interest to them. 2, I should carry an assumption that children are already being safe. if I have come to learn I've come to learn in general that typically developing children, like adults, they have a sense of self-preservation. You know, they don't want to get hurt, but they're also inexperienced at assessing a situation. The third is the environment needs to be set up to say yes. You know, it must meet the children's developmental needs, especially the physical needs. Furniture should be multi-purpose, you know, and be ready for that. And that's where that shelf came in. It's like, yes, it houses toys and can do this, and it's a, you know, it's a spot for toddler parkour, as I like to call it. And the fourth thing was, you know, take away the ask. I can manage the risk by handing control over through language. And so, you know, I forgot how it happened, but essentially I waited for a child to start climbing to the top, you know, after we had this grand plan. And I excitedly rushed over. I saw someone climbing. I said, oh, you know, hey, so-and-so, you know, you can say, I'm climbing, come spot me, rather than saying, hey, can I climb this? Or, you know, but just demanding of the teacher to be ready for them. And that first time, though, and a bunch of times after, you know, the children looked at us like we were up to something, and then they didn't climb. So we kind of got what we wanted, where we negated the climbing, even though we were trying to just give them a process of safety in climbing. But it kind of backfired. But, you know, each year after year with each new class of toddlers, we made sure to introduce that process early on, since one of our values of being that, you know, children are capable, they're already being safe, the environment is saying yes, and I'm going to take away the ask. So we introduced that later on, or early on. And, you know, it just really creates a whole other dynamic in the relationship, where it isn't this top down, like, oh, we don't do that in the class, or you need to ask me before you do it. It's more of telling the child, you let me know when you're ready and I'll be there. And, you know, and sometimes, you know, of course, there will be times where I have to say, or a co-teacher will say, I can't spot you right now, but give me a moment. Or I'll set a timer. I'll be like, I'll come spot you in this amount of minutes, and then I'll be there. You know, I think moving to that place nudges children to the center, but that also means that we got to get out of the way if we're going to get them in the center. And I know that kind of sounds contradictory to me saying we should be in the center, but again, it's not just one thing, right? It's a give and take with these things. You know, and so, yeah, like it just became a manageable thing by giving a little bit of coaching. And, you know, midway through the year, or even before that, like we can just step back and let them do their thing. And then there's no power struggle.
So that was when you were working with toddlers, right?
Yeah. So helping them, you know, coaching them to, you know, the first part of coaching was just like letting them know that they need someone to kind of be there to make sure if they fall, we're going to catch them. And so, and just us having that awareness that they're there. And then, you know, after we had that process down, then it was the actual physical coaching, which was totally easy. Like your hand goes here, your feet go here, just helping them coordinate their body. But yeah, that was like with the toddlers.
So because you work with toddlers, is that why you keep a picture of yourself as a toddler by your desk? And also, what does your shirt say? Because I love your shirt.
Oh yeah. I got it from here. What does it say? Fly above the
storms. Okay.
Storms. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's a native person riding an eagle.
Perfect.
Yeah.
All right. But why do you carry a picture of a toddler of yourself?
Yeah, it was, you know, it's a reminder to myself, you know, how would I have wanted to be treated at that age? I highly encourage, you know, educators to hang a picture of themselves at the age of the same children that they work with. You know, how would I have wanted to be welcomed into the class? How would I have wanted to be helped with my feelings or acknowledged in my feelings as a 2-year-old? And anybody who picks up my book, you can see my toddler picture in the back of it, and you'll see what picture I had up. You know, but I do acknowledge that sometimes it's not possible to have a picture of yourself as a child, but maybe think about how your child self would want to be treated in your care in class, and maybe even think about writing yourself a letter that you can, to that age that you're working with, but to yourself, and keep it, somewhere where you can see it as a reminder.
I'm glad you said that, because I personally don't have any photos, even though I'm with the fours. I personally don't have any photos of myself as a toddler. I think the only photo I've had, like the earliest one, is when I was about 7. It was of me posing on the playground. I still remember it to this day. Me posing on the playground, like putting on my muscles. Not much.
Oh, I got to see this.
Yeah. And I have a lot more hair than I had back then. And it wasn't until a recent presentation that we both sat in by Dr. Amir Gilmore, who's a professor at your alma mater, Washington State University.
Go Cougs.
Every time you say that, I have to wait for you to say "Go Cougs."
Yeah.
And in Professor Gilmore, in his presentation, he talked a lot about Black boy joy. And since then, I've really been thinking hard about these two concepts, and really being intentional in reclaiming that joy I had in my photo, and then that joy of me playing. And I just don't think that we are intentional as adults in playing anymore. We as educators, we observe children playing, we document children playing, we read and write stories of children playing. But where do we find time in our lives to actually engage and play ourselves? So why do you think that? And Sally, I'm actually going to bring you in to this conversation as well, to hear your thoughts. But I'm going to kick it to Nick first.
Yeah, I think that is a pitfall. I wanted to say a loophole, but it's a pitfall that I think adults, and again, the fallacy of teaching, right, is sort of what you described. Like, oh, we need to step back. We need it to be child driven. And again, this is that like fine balance of what's child centered. When do we come into the center? When do we get out of the way? But I really believe that you have to play to understand children's play. I think participating is the best tool of observation. If you ain't playing, you ain't teaching, in my opinion, and especially in early childhood. And yes, we are teacher researchers, or I would implore if you don't see yourself as that, I implore you to start putting on that hat and seeing yourself as such. But we, again, like I said before, we don't do it from a distance. We do it in participation, or we should be, all the while considering what we know about child development. Play strengthens our relationships with children, and strong relationships bring stronger understanding of the people you're in relationship with. And, I love a good quote, Mike, and this is the one I've held on to for a bit, and it resonated when you're saying that is, we don't stop playing because we grow old. We grow old because we stop playing. And so I'm going to kick it over to Sally.
Yeah, I think for me, being in the classroom, I love to play. I'm as Teacher Tom would say, an accidental educator. I was a fine artist and ended up in education because of my son's struggles. And I actually experienced some shame for my playful nature, because it really isn't the culture that, to be on the ground with the children, to be engaged. So I do think it's really important that we know how to play, we know how to be, and I think it's really being with the children, as you said, empty, not coming in with an agenda, not coming in with, this is what we're going to do, but play happens spontaneously. And it doesn't really have a purpose, right? Like at its height, at its glory, we're just playing and there's really no end goal in mind. And I think that's sometimes hard for educators to be goalless.
Yeah, and it kind of, reminds me of, I think I've said this to you, Mike, like, when we think about musicians, like, do they only read and write sheet music? Do they only listen to music? No, they have to participate in it. Any like proficient musician has to play their instrument, right? And even that accidental play and that freestyle play. That's what we call like jamming, you know, and just really getting on the same wavelength of other musicians. And I think that's the same with the teacher and the child dynamic. Sally, I'm going to ask you. Oh yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say one other thing that I noticed, that just something that I find very curious, is that we do that with babies. We play with them and engage, but there hits an age we stop it. And I find that's interesting, that we let go of that playful engagement. I don't know if you guys have noticed that, but there's like a certain age where it's not okay anymore.
Yeah, and maybe because we're like, okay, now it's time to learn, even though play is learning. Do you have any thoughts on that, Mike?
No, I agree. I'm always trying to figure out ways, like when I pop over after I finish with the 4s and I pop over to our remote learning classroom to support them, I'm always thinking about, okay, this kid hates math, right? Or does not like sitting and engaging in math, but he loves Minecraft. So how can I scaffold or find ways to make connections like that? Because that's something he already has interest in. We're going to have a child-led philosophy. We're going to also be emergent and really center our children. Let's take what they already like and then find ways to weave all of their different, learning objectives or whatever the state mandates us to do in. And then I'm finding ways to extrapolate opportunities for him to get what he needs in order to pass into the 5th grade or whatever grade he's in. It's all a blur.
Yeah. So Sally, I'll throw you another question, and it's a super easy one. You know, what do you think we need to do as an industry in order to promote equitable play? Super easy.
It's really easy. Well, personally, I think it's to really bring reflective practice in, because we have to begin to self-examine where we're at. And for myself, it's what I don't know that I don't know about my own perception, that I have to be willing to step in and look, you know, like I'm in process. And I think when you have committed to make that as a standard, that we're evolving as human beings. I think you guys said earlier, you know, like we're in a transformational game here. And I think the minute I'm not looking at where I can become more fully human and more awake, then the game's done for me. You know, it's like, I think, but education is not an art form right now. It's I think, a politically driven system that's deeply flawed.
Mm-hmm.
But I think grassroots, yeah.
My mind goes to how a lot of the things that we were taught, we just kind of copy and paste it into our own learning environments. So how can we be more dynamic with it in order to, especially if we're already a play-based, right, curriculum or center, right? That's easy. But I'm thinking about how do I not just preach to the choir, right? But how can we work with other organizations who might not be so privy or might be a little bit reluctant to a play-based curriculum, and how can we work with them to help them be more dynamic, also be more aware of religious holidays, right? Or just different religions, because not everyone in cultures play looks different for them or might not even be a thing. I'm also thinking about what are some of the barriers that we implement within our environments that that doesn't allow for inclusive play. You know, a lot of things sometimes are high up, which is about ableism. You know, I'm also thinking about how educators who might not be able-bodied, how can we support them so that they can be engaging in play and fostering that within their community. And then I'm also looking at it. I'm also looking at a lot of different things, right? I'm thinking about how we, as administration or as leadership, how can we create an environment in which everyone can kind of keep learning with and from each other in order to build that play community, and then break down those barriers. So those are some of the things that just off the top of my mind.
Yeah, when you were saying that, like a lot of I had seen a bunch of classrooms, and there was always a lot of furniture, right? And like that's like one of the, I think, to what you're, that just popped in my head when you were talking about that. Like how is the environment set up, again, to for people who move differently and for different abilities, and oftentimes I think educators throw a bunch of again, like physical barriers, because they don't want kids to run around in the class. And so the way they, to mitigate that is just put more furniture in the area. And you go into those rooms and you're like, oh my goodness. And like, it almost feels like a department store with aisles, and like, it feels sort of suffocating.
And I was thinking about one of our other classrooms. They were doing, they captured a video of 3 or 4 children playing, and one of their dolls had a wheelchair. And then I was reflecting with the educators on, okay, what next can we introduce into this classroom so we can extend that learning around how different people move, different body types and things like that. And then one of the things that we introduced more of was more building materials, and we set up a space around that. And then we actually put stuff higher up so that they can engage in thinking about, oh, well, I can't get it because I'm smaller, right? And then we will pose a question on, oh, what if you didn't have any legs, like the dolls you were playing with yesterday? So creating that, how can we bring that back into the classroom and make it a teachable moment for our children?
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, that's me rambling. But but I think it connects, right? Because play is an equity issue, and that's an issue of equity. And I think part of that is because why just play in general is an equity issue. I think part of that is because communities of color, we often believe that schools should look a certain way, right? Schools should be children sitting at a desk, learning the multiplication tables, raising their hands. I guess for you, Nick, have you ever, how have you communicated with your community that you're in now, which is mostly a community of color, that play is learning and that play is essential?
Well, yeah, I mean, I haven't, in my short time here, like I haven't had a chance to really get into that with, we're trying to move to a place of thriving after this pandemic, and like get right back into, moving from surviving to thriving. But, I mean, I do see what you mean. And I think it's more subtle to the perception that you're it's that, and there's more subtle ways, especially in early childhood education, particularly curriculums, what I like to call for-profit curricula, often implore educators to litter their classrooms with literacy, essentially labeling them, because, but if we consider the white supremacy value of worship of the written word, you realize the implicit bias that urges families, especially families of color, to equate success in life to particular perspectives of education. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about. And, and consider the history of languages being eradicated and barely hanging on. Now we have these huge movements of native languages being reawakening. And that's because of, all colonization. And right now that's a big buzzword for education. And another big buzzword is decolonize. And in my opinion, if you want to decolonize your classroom, then take the labels off. What ways can you push back on these for-profit curricula to and have a justification of why you don't want to do it this particular way? but also, Mike, I think it's, equally important that we empower families by providing an understanding of the brain science behind play, right? Making it delivering it in digestible ways. I had seen some mini documentary of an organization that went around the world, and they watched families just do their thing with children. And then they would share back how it promotes healthy brain development. They would tell the families, what you're doing is like, it's doing this for this part of the brain. And this is what, how it is scientific or mathematic. And, and then they would also share like what they could do in follow-up steps. And, they visited a couple of communities in Ghana. And that's one of the videos that really stuck out to me, was this mother with she was doing her dishes, and her little 1-year-old is just kind of like, what do I do? And she's like, here you go. Here's a bucket of water. Here's some dishes. And the kid's just dumping and pouring, satisfying those schemas that we all have, right? These learning schemas of dumping and pouring. It's a global human thing. And so they broke that down in a culturally relevant way. And the mother started crying. It was just like, what? That's building science and math? And they're like, yeah. And so, I think as an industry and as a field, we need to do better at making what we know and the science behind it more culturally relevant and deliverable to families. So that way they can feel empowered to advocate for play down the road. And I think in the past, I have and again, this will sound contradictory to my literacy, but I've talked to families and educators about how kicking an object or ball, for example, can help literacy by strengthening the eye muscles as it tracks the foot connecting with the ball. Strong eye muscles help tracking letters in a sentence, and just sort of, how our eyes move back and forth.
With the literacy piece, I feel like we are trying to inundate our classrooms with books and standardized testing now. So I'm really starting to worry, because I think in the United States, at least, there's a push to make preschool more like kindergarten. And so I guess, do you have any thoughts on how we can preserve childhood and play in our settings against those who want to make that shift in it?
Yeah, I think, preserving childhood should start by respecting childhood for what it is. And when we consider school readiness, I think we need to open that concept up a bit and emphasize social emotional skills and tasks more than traditional academics as school readiness. And I also believe we should, fully embrace that early childhood is birth to 8 years old. That's like 8 years. Like that's correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's the last thing I read, is early childhood is considered birth to 8. So why not ensure that play-based curriculums are all the way to the 3rd grade, where there's lots of movement and project-based learning and opportunities for children to learn about themselves as learners, as well as other people, through those social emotional tasks and skills. So I think, I would implore people who want to make preschool a school-ready environment. Yes, do that, but maybe rethink about, what does school readiness mean? School readiness should lead us into be life ready.
Absolutely. Don't teach kindergarten readiness, teach lifelong success.
Right.
All right. I only got one last question to you. I got my COVID vaccine, so I'm slowing down right now.
Oh, yeah.
So my last question to you, Nick, and it's kind of layered. So when I think about this risky play is risky business, my mind first went to gunplay. And I think because of gunplay, it could be considered risky for some people. And I think if we don't make gunplay into a teachable moment, it can have some pretty deadly consequences in the future. So that's why I want to dig into gunplay with you, especially since I think that it's a universal game across the world that children end up playing or see somewhere along the lines as they're growing up. And I realize this question isn't necessarily a black and white thing, right? It's not just cut and dry. It's much more complex. But what side of the fence are you on, Nick?
Yeah. Well, again, I'm going to talk sort of general and hopefully get there. But, I think when we consider this play, as with all play, children engaging caregivers and educators need to be ready to respond rather than react and provide context for what children are playing. Being responsive in my perspective is to participate and offer insight and context to what's being played. Being reactive generally goes right to just shutting it down, cutting off the head to cure the headache. There's no substance to it, right? It's just like, nope, stop. We don't do that. For gunplay, this is a very fine line for educators to walk. And often children's gunplay, from what I've seen, is usually rooted in sci-fi storylines, stormtroopers, Marvel characters, Legos, and all of that. But that's not to say that, maybe kids in an urban setting are actually playing cops versus blacks and reenacting the murders happening. So there ends up, again, there's no there's no right answer for this for sure, because we're all bringing different stories and perspectives to this. And an Inuit child might do gunplay because they have a love for hunting. But importantly, again, what context are we experiencing the gunplay? Is it in a childcare setting, again, in an urban environment where, where Black people have been murdered by police? Is it a suburb just outside of that urban environment? How are they processing it? Are those kids just being stormtroopers? There's no one size fits all approach to this hot topic, and other than being responsive, I think, in an age appropriate manner that invites children in to participate in finding out, why we might want to avoid this kind of play. And the adult needs to be ready to model openness and curiosity and trust in the child's knowledge. I think I shared with you when I first started here at Daybreak, I had overheard a teacher just yell, "We don't gunplay. We do not do this here at Daybreak." And I, my self-reflective self wanted to come in and be like, "Oh, well, let's explore why we don't. Why are we saying no? We can't just cut off the head to cure the headache," And because I viewed her approach more reactionary, and I was, I want to cultivate a learning environment that is responsive. But then she had told me, she's like, "I'm going to text all the families right now and let them know that they need to discourage their kids from gunplay, because we had, I think about a year ago, one of a child's dad was murdered by police." That put my self-reflective self right in check. All right. And again, that's that fine line. That's that, what have I experienced and have learned to be best practices isn't going to be, again, one size fits all for everybody. So, and especially, what is my role in this community as somebody who's new in this community? Do I come in and be like, "Well, no, let's explore why we don't, let's go through the process." But in reality, I have to honor what community has already established. What about you, Mike?
I personally go back and forth on this probably every other minute. I'm on either side of the fence. I know personally I'm super uncomfortable with it. There's historical trauma for me. And at the same time, I do think that there's so much value in allowing them to do gunplay. And I have to constantly fight the urge to not interrupt children's gunplay right away. Which wasn't always the case. Before, I would just shut it down as soon as it starts. I would see it and I would just jump in and be like, "Nope, this is done. Let's go read a book. Let's move on." And I think now I'm waiting for a very juicy moment when I see it happening to interrupt. And because you can always revisit the entire gunplay at a later time, right? But shutting it down right away might mean you're missing out on such a good teachable moment that will have ripple effects. And it's when I circle back that I let them know that I felt super uncomfortable with it, and that sometimes mean people do bad things with guns. Um, and then one time, I always like to share personal stories, right, to connect, to build that emotional intelligence. I'll share with them that one time, the bad people with the gun did something to hurt my dad, and that I'm hoping we don't ever touch a gun in real life or play pretend with it. But once again, if they still want to continue to do it, I'm going to honor the voice around that, which is super hard. But I want to honor and respect children's voice. Um, I remember one time I said that same thing around. Um, I hope when we don't touch a real gun in real life, or don't pretend to play with it. And the children, they looked at me and they said, okay. And then they put down like their toy guns, but they picked up a toy knife and were like, oh, we're going to knife fight. And I was like, oh, well, I don't know if that's any better, but we'll take it. That's why I'm like on the fence with that one. And
Right.
go ahead.
Oh no, I'm agreeing with you.
So, part two of this question centers on race. And I think a lot about gunplay when children of color are involved. So, I kind of want to use this last piece as a chance to just raise people's level of consciousness of how impactful race is, and then why we do need to be mindful of it. So, how different is the conversation for you when there is, let's say, one child of color and one white child pretending to shoot each other, as opposed to when it's two white children pretending to shoot each other?
Yeah, I think it's it's like I mentioned before. This conversation and outcome is going to be different for everybody. Not everyone has the same experience or perception about guns in general. Um, and like most situations children are in, our responses and reactions are dictated by our stories we bring with us. And that may be some trauma that happened with guns. It may be a happy memory with guns, like hunting or sport shooting with family members. And like we touched on earlier, it could be an aversion, like kind of like the aversion towards rough and tumble play, because you saw someone get significantly injured. Part of walking that fine line I mentioned earlier is how much of our experience and or trauma do we allow to influence our responses and reactions. And I and honestly, that's probably a whole other presentation. um, and what we should keep in mind though is that educators and adults in general should remain rooted in their values, whether it's pro gun play or not pro gun play, or I don't know. If you don't want gunplay to be a thing, then be prepared to invite the child in to explore why. Kind of like what you did, and telling personal stories is so effective, right? And again, like you alluded to, it may not stop them from playing gunplay, but or playing violent play, we should say. But you're at least planting that seed, right? And we got to recognize that there's not going to be, again, we're not going to fix something right away, and whatever works in the moment is probably not going to be sustained in the long run. But we got to keep giving them these experiences through conversations. And if you are, pro gun play or violent play, like, you got to be prepared to invite children in, to give them the other side of it, to give them alternative views on guns or knives, and to have those honest conversations about differing perceptions. Um, what I have told very explicitly when, because I never answered your other question, but like, I'm on the pro gun play and pro violent play side, but I'm not the only person in the class, right? So it can't just be my opinion and my feeling that's going to be the end or say all end all. I have to consider my co-teachers and their shared stories and histories and experiences and traumas. Um, and what I've told children very directly is, like, for some people in their families, gunplay is a very scary thing, and not everyone is okay with it. That's just being very clear about that. And then, and then we just dive into their whys and kind of extrapolate it. And I think I have found that just having the conversation over and over, and maybe the child is just like, they're privy to the point where like, oh, I'm going to have this conversation again. Kind of, it kind of helps negate the gunplay. But I also, while that may be true, I do hold faith and belief in the child that they're processing like, oh yeah, here's this conversation. I know what they're going to say because of X, Y, and Z, and good. I want you to, have that in your head, because that's going to, I think only get stronger, or at least it'll give you a strong foundation for critically thinking about this particular thing.
My coffee's done, so that's all I have for you. I guess, Sally, I'm just interested in hearing your reflections and what came up for you as someone who is almost felt like you're like listening to a private conversation.
Oh my God. It was just, yeah, no, I just really honor both of you and the depth that you go together, and with such ease and honesty. It's such to me, I think every educator needs a relationship like that, where you can unpack things. And I'm really present to, the people in my life who are there for me, who challenge me, who help me grow. And I hear that, and that I just hear so much like, this is real PD. This is rubber on the cement. This is the real thing. And then also I love the consideration, like with the gunplay, that it's contextual. I was reflecting on my own 20 plus years in the classroom and how I had to be mindful of children. I worked in poverty, of children who had trauma. It was different than I was working in white privilege and they only saw it in cartoons, right? Like, it's two different, they're not relatable. So I think it's really important to be sensitive. And I hear over and over and over again in your conversation, you're listening deeply to the children's voices. And that means, like Nick said, there isn't a black and white or simple answer. And so I really appreciate that deep care about, I think what I'm wondering as I listen to you is we are leaders, Nick, right? We are forming, I think you said, if I can pull it from my brain, architects of the dispositions of children, something to that effect, right? I thought that was so beautiful. I love language, I'm like, that's beautiful.
Yeah, I like putting random words together.
I loved it. And that we are underpaid. We work hard. As you say, we don't have enough people of color or men in the profession. Where I worked, I didn't make a living wage. And yet, to hear the excellence in this conversation for what we're creating for children, my wish is we can turn that tide, that people who are making the future for our humanity get paid what they're worth.
Yeah.
It's time so that we invest ourselves.
Right. And that's kind of the reason I really encourage early childhood educators to see themselves as leaders, because we're good at being, for the most part, I think we have a good tendency to have vulnerable selves, and that's a cornerstone of leadership. And so we're already naturally like oriented to be these strong leaders, and cliches are just simply overstated truths. And the cliche for us is like, we mold the future of children. So it's like, what do we want to do with that? Do we, like Mike and I always talk about, like, do we continue to just encourage and maintain the status quo, or do we throw a wrench in it and restructure and reframe what we want for the future? Because we've already seen all the historical oppression and systematic forms of oppression come to a head in this last year in the United States. It all just bottled up and it's erupting, and it's continuing to erupt, and it's not going to change unless we change the systems, right? And it starts by listening to Black, Indigenous, and Brown voices. And because we're the ones who are on the tail end of it, and we know what we want to see changed.
Exactly. And this work, it's so paramount that we remember that the work doesn't stop when you leave your learning environment. The work can't just happen in a vacuum of the four walls. Well, if you're in a brick and mortar building, right? Because learning environments look all different. But wherever your learning environment is, it can't just stop there. You need to carry it out into the supermarket. You need to carry it out into the post office. And then you need to also pick up the phone and call your legislators and vote and be active participants, right? What we want for our children, and Nick said it earlier, there's not a lot of difference between 2-year-olds and 20-year-olds, right? We're just we can string sentences together a little bit better. So make sure that we are being active citizens, just like we want our children to be active citizens in the learning environment.
Yeah, and to your point, Mike, that leadership or this work doesn't happen in a vacuum, because early childhood education, especially in my perception, should be a lifestyle. Nothing changes once I leave Daybreak or once I left Hilltop. And that's what makes us leaders, and that's what makes us accountable, or people who should be accountable to the progress of society, I think. Agreed.
I would love for you to tell people how to contact you at Hilltop for you have professional development. People can contact you and have it brought to their centers. I think you looking at the page of opportunities that you provide, it's amazing. So how can people reach you?
Yeah, so you can visit our website at www.hilltopcc, that's C for cookie.com. You can find us you can find our podcast, which is called Napcast, on where all the streaming, I'm trying to think, what do you say? What do I hear?
On all major podcasting platforms.
Yeah, exactly. So Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Anchor, and then you can always shoot us an email at institute@hilltopcc, once again, C for cookie.org. That comes to me. You just say what you want, and then we'll make it happen.
Oh, thank you again so much for a rich and powerful conversation that I know is going to make a huge difference. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
and you guys are going to do a Facebook Live.
Yes.
You guys are going to be jamming in Facebook, and so we'll make the deets below. So excited about that. And you guys can go and hang out with them and have a conversation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Love it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.